It is so good to be with you guys here this Sunday. I'm thankful for Pastor Stephen for that lovely intro. So like he mentioned before, he and I knew each other from my home church where I grew up and eventually started doing ministry there, and that's kind of where we met. It was also at my home church that I met my eventual wife, Joy, who's here with me today. Pastor Steve Yu, if some of you guys may know him, he actually met my wife on a medical missions trip to Guatemala, and he thought we might be a good match, so he actually brought her out to a couple of high school camps. Eddie knows the story pretty well, and I didn't notice her for the first couple times. And then, it took a couple of tries, but long story short, he finally sent me on an errand down to San Diego where she was at school and told me not to come back up unless I was able to at least have coffee with Eddie's blessing. And so by the grace of God, with the help of the two of them, with some older brothers, 7 years later, this past June, we actually got married. Thank you. So right after the wedding, we hopped on a plane to Asia for a honeymoon. And, as a lot of trips go, there are a lot of good things about traveling, and there are a lot of things that are not so good about traveling. Some of the not so good things, going to the airport. If you guys have been to LAX in the last couple of months or maybe this past year, you know that traffic is only getting worse and worse. And so when my wife and I went to LAX to get dropped off for our flight, we couldn't even make it to the terminal. We actually had to get dropped off about 1.5 miles from the airport, and then we joined a bunch of other people who were walking with their luggages in hand to the airport, and we got there just in the nick of time. We were sweating, we were tired. It was a really, really cranky start to our trip. And so, airplane travel, flights, those things are a thing that we don't like about travel, right? Another thing that we don't like about travel, the jet lag when you come back home. So, when you go on a trip, waking up at 4 or 5 in the morning, when you get to your destination, it's not terrible. You get up, you can go walk around your area, you can have a nice breakfast, and by the time you've done all of that, the sun is just coming up, and so you have the whole day in front of you. The problem is when you come back home and the same thing happens. You're trying to go to sleep. You wake up at 3 in the morning. You're like, oh my gosh, I got to go back to sleep. I've got work in the morning. And the older you get, the longer this jet lag process becomes. When you're younger, 1 day or 2 days after, you're fine. And then, you get older, it's a week, sometimes it's 2 weeks, and you're like, I don't know if this vacation was worth it anymore. And you're just struggling to get back to work. And then one last thing about travel that may not be good. Your body's seemingly lack of immunity against foreign bug bites. The mosquitoes, spiders, whatever else is crawling around when you're in the morning, at night, you wake up, and now your leg looks like a constellation or like the connected dots that your kids can have fun with later. And you're just trying to not scratch it, and so you're scratching around, you're slapping, you're trying to put whatever on there, and the whole time you're just praying that you don't get another one, but you do. And so there's a lot of things that we don't like about travel, right? But there are also things that we do like about travel, and I think for each person, that's a little bit different. And so, some people like having a fun time with friends and family. Some people like the beautiful scenery. But there's one thing that I like in particular that I don't know if any other people like here in this room. I've shared this to other people, and people have thought that I'm kind of weird. And so one of the things that I like about travel actually is airplane food. See, I told you. So no matter how tired I am on the airplane, or no matter how full I am, when you're on an airplane and you smell the food cart coming down, I always wake up. The stickers that they have that say, please wake me for meals, I always make sure that that's on my seat just so that I know that they'll wake me up, and if they don't, I get kind of mad. And so I love it because you go down, and depending on the airline, they have different kinds of food. Depending on where you're going, the food changes. And so it's one of those little things that remind me that I'm on vacation. You pull it out of the airplane, and I'm sure it tastes terrible. But you're stuck 35,000 feet in the air, and it tastes amazing. And so my poor wife has had me talk to her over and over again about how much I like this bibimbap from Korean Air. I'm sure if you pull it out of the airplane, it's microwavable rice. It's a few pieces of ground beef. But something about being 35,000 feet in the air and being able to drink instant myeokguk is just it's amazing. And so, maybe not for you, but for me, food, airplane food reminds me that I'm on a trip, that I'm about to have fun, that it's a vacation, that I'm about to enjoy. And so, for many of us, maybe it's not airplane food, but food is a connection point for many of the important moments in our life, right? We get special kinds of food for a child's first birthday. We buy and we grill special kinds of meats and foods for get-togethers and holidays. There's special home-cooked meals when you visit your parents. There's a special restaurant that you'll go to celebrate anniversaries or special moments in life. And so delicious food is great, but it's not the end-all, be-all in these moments. Food is the medium through which life is experienced in all of the special moments and in all of the ordinary moments. And so when we look at Scripture, we see that Jesus uses common everyday objects to teach and to instruct us about the things of life. Sometimes it's through a story, through a parable, through an illustration, and other times it's through what is right in front of him. And so through the Gospels, the reason why I'm talking about food is because one of the common things that Jesus uses as an illustration is food. He calls his first disciples through catching fish. He turns water into wine at a wedding. After he was resurrected, one of the first things he does for his disciples is to cook them breakfast right on the side of the beach. And of course, one of the most famous stories about food in the Bible is the feeding of the 5,000. And so the feeding of the 5,000 is one of the most well-known stories in the Bible. If you've ever grown up in church or in Sunday school, chances are pretty high that you probably colored some bread and some fish for that story, or maybe you had your kids do it. So it's something that is well known. And if you've been in church for a while, you probably have heard that story, or you maybe have read it through as you're doing a Bible reading. And so for many of us, when we hear that story, we've heard it so many different times that at some point it kind of loses its punch. You hear it again and again, and so there's a temptation almost to try to go, okay, yeah, I know, 5,000 people, 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish, it's all broken up, split up, and, that's great. And so we lose the magnitude of kind of when we first read that story because we've heard it over and over again. But this is where I want to take us today, because when we slowly go back and walk through the story, when we kind of remind ourselves, okay, this is more than just a story, then it becomes something that we become amazed as if we were reading through the story the first time. We look at the passage today and we'll see that in this story that there are very important reminders for us, not just from the story itself, but how we can take these truths into our everyday lives and to see that we can use the reminders that God gives us in this story to face our everyday lives with faith and with courage. And so with that said, I'd like to turn us to that passage. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to take a look at Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 44. Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 44. And so we're just going to kind of go through this little by little. It's going to be a story that I hope many of you might know, but we're just going to take it a little bit at a time. So just follow along with me as we go through it, as we go through this story. So verse 30, it says, "The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they have done and taught." And so what's happening during this time right now when it says that they've came back to Jesus and they've told him all of these different things? So we want to talk about that before we jump into this actual story. So the first thing that happened right before the story we're about to jump into is that Jesus just sent his disciples out on their first ministry trip. Call it their first missions trip, call it their first adventure, whatever you want to call it. Essentially what he did back in verse 7 is he said this to them. He called the 12 and he sent them out 2 by 2, gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except the staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and to not put on 2 tunics. If you've ever been on a missions trip, this is probably the most strictest packing list that you'll ever get in your life. Jesus told them, you're not allowed to take anything except the clothes on your back and a staff. He said, don't take the food you're going to rely upon when you go to the villages and towns. The clothes, you're going to have to rely on other people's hospitality. And so he sent them on this missions trip. And as they were going, they actually were able to do the things that they have seen Jesus do. So they went out, they went to go cast out demons, they healed the sick, they prayed for those that were in need, and they proclaimed the kingdom of God. And so all of the things that they saw Jesus do up until that time, they were able to do in pairs. And so when they came back to Jesus, they were excited to say, Jesus, look, all the things that we've seen you do, we were able to do those very same things too. And so they're excited. They're wanting to tell Jesus about all that they have seen and all that they have done. So that's the first thing that had happened just before this. The second major event that happened right before this is the death of John the Baptist by King Herod. And so John the Baptist, if you remember, is Jesus' cousin who baptized Jesus at the start of his ministry. And so after that, John the Baptist actually got put in prison because he criticized the king in the area for marrying his brother's wife. And so he was in prison, and the King Herod, the king that was overseeing that, he liked listening to him, but actually his now new wife, Herodias, actually held a grudge against John the Baptist because of what he said about her. And so through a dinner party, the long story short, King Herod's wife actually manipulates the king to put John the Baptist to death. And so it's an emotional and manipulative story, and it's just the way it turns out is not good for anybody. But John the Baptist was a very well-known person, and so when news of his death came out, the disciples heard about it, and that's the other piece of news that they gave to Jesus. They told him about not only the missions trip that they just came back from, but also the death of his cousin, John the Baptist. And so when the disciples return to Jesus in verse 30, they tell him about all that they have done and seen through the ministry, and as well as the news about the death of John. And so Jesus' response to both of these things, we see in verse 31 and 32, is to take them away to a quiet place. It says this, he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves." And so this desolate place that Jesus mentioned has less to do with the actual area they're going to and more of the nature of the place itself. That oftentimes when we think desolate, we're thinking the wastelands. He's taking them to the middle of the desert somewhere. And it's less about that particular location and more so that in that place there was peace and quiet. That when the realities of life hit Jesus and his disciples, when they were coming back from ministry, that Jesus' response was not so much to go back into the busy work and ministry and all of the different things that they were doing, but to intentionally pause. And so in this time, we see Jesus saying to his disciples, it's been a really busy time. What we're going to do is we're going to get on a boat. We're going to go over to a place where there's no one else but us, and we're going to spend some time to be able to reconnect with God, to be able to replenish what was lost, to even be able to mourn a loss in the community, and just to have that time by themselves. And so, if you put yourself in the shoes of the disciples, imagine after you had come back from a missions trip or from a camp or what have you, and that's all you want to do. You want to go to your desolate place. For some people, that's home. For other people, that's camping somewhere. For other people, it's, wherever it is. But that's all you want to do. You want to be in a place where it's peaceful, when it's quiet, you get a chance to reconnect with God. But as they left the boat, here is the problem. They got recognized. Remember, this was Jesus and his disciples. So Jesus is a story in itself because, he's been doing all these miracles, but now his disciples are also recognized because they just had come back and they had just been done casting out demons, healing the sick, on all of that. And so the crowd recognizes all of them, right? And at this point, he's seen as even greater than John the Baptist, who had an incredibly large following. And so they saw them leave on the boat across the lake. And so as they see them launch the boat, the crowds are actually able to guess where Jesus is going to be. And so they spread the news. And so what it says is in verse 33, now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there from all of the other towns and got there ahead of them. Can you imagine how fast you would have to run to outrun a boat? And can you imagine how many places? So you can say there are only so many places that Jesus could have landed the boat, and the crowd picked the right one. They predicted where he was going to go because they saw and they wanted to see Jesus and the disciples, so they kept running. And when the boat got to the other side of the lake, the crowds were already there waiting for them. When was the last time where you went anywhere, and you saw an enormous crowd and you breathed a sigh of relief? Like, oh, thank God, I'm so glad that all of these people are here. What is our normal reaction when we see a crowd? We're frustrated, we're angry, irritated. Think of the freeways that we have to go through in Southern California. The U.S. Department of Transportation reported in 2011 that the 405 freeway from the 22 to Seal Beach sees 379,000 vehicles, not individuals, vehicles per day. That's 138 million cars going bumper to bumper where the 405, the 605, and the 22 freeway all converge. That's a crowd, and no one goes, oh, I'm so happy to be going bumper to bumper on the 405. I would love to be nowhere else. Just this is my spot. This is where I want to be. Think about Disneyland. The happiest place on earth becomes the most miserable place on earth when you arrive and you see nothing but crowds of people pushing and shoving each other to get a few spaces ahead so that they can cut their 2-hour wait time a couple of minutes back. And so there was a report that came from the Theme Entertainment Association that said about 18 million people visit Disneyland, just Disneyland Park, and another 9 million visit California Adventure in 2016 alone. If you're thinking about getting an annual pass, now is not the time. If you know, and if you've ever been to Disneyland, you know the pure joy of just having space to walk around by yourself. And you look up your little app and it says, oh, the wait time is 45 minutes, we gotta go. And you know the pure horror of having to walk and try to fight your way into a shuttle. So that way the shuttle can take you back to the parking structure where then you get to sit in your car again and wait to go all the way back down out the exit. So here's the thing though. For the most part in our lives, we simply are around crowds, but these crowds are not there for us. In most cases, we're actually a part of that same crowd. But what if the crowds were not just a part of where you were, but they are actually there for you? So folks who work at restaurants would know this very well. It's the terror of the lunchtime rush. With people that are on their lunch break, they come back in, they want all their food at the right time, and then they want them to have the check because 15 minutes later they have to go back to work, and they all come at once, and you gotta take 20 orders at one time trying to memorize. It's terror. Or people who work at a retail store on Black Friday with the crowds pouring in, and you're the one that's assigned to crowd control. That's, you're not a part of the crowd at that point. That crowd is coming for you, and they're gonna go right past you, and maybe or maybe not, you'll survive. And that's what Jesus and his disciples encountered when they were landing on the other side of the lake. It was supposed to be a time of peace and quiet, but instead, they found an expectant crowd of 5,000 men, not including the women and children. So to put that in perspective, there were a lot of small towns and a lot of small villages around the Sea of Galilee, and most of those cities and towns only had about a couple thousand people at most. So put that in perspective, there was 5,000 people at least that met Jesus and his disciples when they got off the boat. And so the crowd was larger than an entire town, and they were waiting for them. This was not part of the original plan that Jesus had told them when they were going to go out. They were expecting a quiet place, maybe a place to rest, a bite to eat. It said that they hadn't even had a chance to eat. And they had just come back from a lot of ministry. They've been going from town to town. They've been healing the sick. They've been casting out demons. And so as they came back, now imagine their reaction when they were trying to expect peace and quiet, and they saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of more people waiting for them as soon as they got off the boat. So if you were a disciple and you were sitting in that boat, what would you have done? The church answer is to say, well, if I was on the boat, then, I would have been happy to come aboard with Jesus, and I would go and I'd help him out to do all this ministry. And that's a nice answer. But if you're like me, the answer would have probably sounded more like this. You would have kind of looked out, and the fog is kind of lifting, and you're like, are those mountains, or is that a town? Are we off, lost? And then you just see it's a crowd of people all over. You're like, nope, Jesus, we're turning this back around. We're going to go back to the middle of the lake, and we're going to wait them out. We're just going to wait until they disperse. Or if they're all here, then we can go back the other way, because now that place is peace and quiet. And so we're going to go, and we're going to avoid this crowd. Jesus, anything but land the boat here. Please, anything, literally anything else. Please, do what you have to do. I don't want to be here. Right? The thought of, and the reason why I know that this would be my answer is that's my default when I'm thrown something at the end of the day, when there's one more thing that I was not expecting. The thought of one more errand, the thought of one more phone conversation that was unexpected. Meeting someone that was not planned is something that I would love nothing more to do than to avoid. But we look at Jesus' reaction in verse 34. In 34, he says this: when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Let's stop there. The crowds were described as sheep without a shepherd. What does that mean? What happens to sheep without a shepherd? If you do any kind of study on sheep, you realize that without a shepherd, they don't survive very well. They require a lot of care because they're unable to take care of themselves. Without a shepherd to guide them, they will get lost, they'll get left behind, they're unable to find the pastures that they need to go feed. And so both Jesus and his disciples were seeing the same thing. They were seeing sheep without shepherd, but their reactions were probably different. When the disciples went ashore and saw the great crowd, the passage would have probably read something like this. The disciples went ashore, they saw a great crowd, and they were terrified because they were like sheep without a shepherd. But it says that Jesus saw the crowd, and because they were like sheep without a shepherd, he had compassion on them. And back to verse 34, it says, and as he had compassion on them, he began to teach them many things. His compassion for the crowds moved him to take the time to care for them. Now, it doesn't say exactly how long that Jesus was teaching for, but we know that it was some time because in verse 35, it says this, and when it grew late, his disciples came to him. So from however long and however early Jesus was teaching this crowd, it was now late in the afternoon. And so let's put ourselves back in the disciples' shoes again. Not only were they denied the vacation that they were promised, they had just come back from doing this long missions trip. They are tired, they are hungry, and now they're stuck doing crowd control for Jesus with a population of 5,000 people trying to figure out what the heck is going on in my life right now. And it's getting late. So when I read this verse, it reminded me of when I was a kid and I would have to beg my mom to head home after I heard her talking for hours with her friends at their house. And it's always a process, right? It's first, mom would move from the living room to the front door. Then from the front door, she would put on her shoes. Then the conversation would then take place on the other side of the door. Then you walk from the front door to the car, and the conversation would take another couple of minutes at the car. Then you drive home, and then first thing you hear when you come home, the phone rings, and so the conversation keeps going there. And so when I read this verse, I was thinking about that memory when I hear the disciples say, in verse 35, the disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. It sounds very similar to what I would tell my mom. Mom, it's very late, and I don't want to be here anymore. But the disciples were coming for a good reason. I mean, sure, they were cranky, sure, they were tired, but remember, they were in this place called a desolate place, which meant that they were probably in the countryside, and the nearest town was probably a little ways away. And so 5,000 people came here to listen to Jesus, and they were very hungry at this point. And it was late enough in the afternoon. If you've done any kind of crowd control, you know that it takes some time for crowds to leave anywhere from where they're from. And so the disciples are thinking, oh my goodness, we need to make sure all these people get home and they go home to eat, because if we wait any longer, it's going to get too late and it'll get too dangerous, and then we'll be stuck with at least 5,000 hungry people who want us to take care of them. And so they were trying to do what they could to avoid a disaster on their hands. So hence, they come back to Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, I mean, it's great that you went and you taught all these people, but I mean, look at the time. It's time for them to go home. Extremely logical. In verse 36, they say to Jesus about the crowds, here's the plan, Jesus. Send them away to the surrounding countryside and villages so that they could buy themselves something to eat. It's a reasonable request. The crowds are large. They need to take care of themselves. Let's send them away to the towns so they can buy their dinner, and then afterwards they can go home, and then our plan can get back on track. We're going to go to find another desolate place, because clearly this place isn't desolate anymore, and we're going to finally get our vacation back on track. And so, the disciples were hungry, tired, and this is a perfectly reasonable request, in their minds at least. But what does Jesus normally do? He has other plans. He tells them the thing that they least want to hear. In verse 37, he doesn't tell them, all right, you're right, we're going to go home. Or, hey, that's a great idea, let's start dismissing the crowds. In verse 37, it says, but he answered them, you give them something to eat. Imagine being one of those disciples at that moment. Remember, there are 12 of you, right? There's 12 of you. And Jesus just asked you, it sounds like, to foot the bill for 5,000 people worth of meals. What would be your reaction? The disciples kind of look at each other, look at Jesus, look at each other. And in verse 37, it says, they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? Is this a genuine question? Maybe it was sarcasm. Maybe it was an actual question, or maybe the disciples were just trying to be smart Alex. It doesn't really say. But the question remains, how are they supposed to feed this crowd? Picture it this way. A denarius, 1 denarii, was equal to 1 day's worth of wages. And so, according to research in 2017, the median household income in the U.S. is about $60,000, which is about $164 for 1 denarius. So the disciples figured to feed the whole group of 5,000 people would have cost them about $33,000 to feed the entirety of the crowd. When's the last time you had a restaurant bill come out and it was $33,000? It was a genuine problem for these disciples because remember, when they first followed Jesus, they weren't exactly rich either. They were, fishermen. They were making a modest living. And then remember, not only were they fishermen, they left their fishing business behind to go follow Jesus. And so now, when you imagine what they're thinking, Jesus just asked them to feed 5,000 people for $33,000, and he's like, Jesus, did you forget? We don't have any money. This is financially impossible. And then Jesus' reply to them when they say, do we need 200 denarii to go and feed all these people? Verse 38, he says, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. So Jesus then patiently directs them to what they're supposed to do. He said, go out in the crowd, take a look, and see what we've got to work with. And so they go around the crowd, and, if you're 12 people trying to go around 5,000 people, it's chaos, right? You're trying to figure out, people are talking all over the place, and you're like, who has food? Who has food? And, these 12 guys are trying to grab food from other people to bring it back to Jesus. And so they do that. They come back, and all they've managed to find, in verse 38, it says, when they have found out what was in the crowd, they said 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Finding out that there was only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish was probably not that much comforting for the disciples, because even if they split the food for the entire crowd, most people wouldn't even see the food. It was such a small amount of food that it didn't make a dent in the situation at all. So at this point, probably the disciples are convinced, you know what? Jesus asked us to go look. Maybe he thought that there was going to be food for everybody, but there isn't. There's 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. The sun is still out. There's still time to send the crowds home. Let's get back on track, Jesus. Please, for the love of God, send these people home. Any minute now, they're thinking he's going to send them home. Except, again, Jesus does the exact opposite. In verse 39 and 40, it says, and then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So essentially what he's telling everyone is, hey, we're about to eat. Everyone sit down. Can you imagine the faces on the disciples' faces? It's like, Jesus, we have no food. There's nothing here. Send them home. But they sat down in groups by hundreds and 50s. And so the crowd is now, because they would only sit down on this grass because they thought it was a giant picnic. And so now the crowd is expecting food, and the disciples are like, oh my goodness, we're going to have an angry crowd on our hands. And so where's the meal? There's no meal. Wouldn't it make sense to send them home? At this point, the disciples, I'm sure, just threw up their hands and said, you know what, Jesus, this is on you now at this point. We've tried to save you multiple times. We've told you that it's late. We said that we're going to send the crowds home. We had a game plan. You didn't listen to us. We went and did what you asked us to do, and there was only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And after all of that, you're still having them go eat? Okay, Jesus, this is on you. You do what you got to do. And so the crowds are all seated, and everyone's looking at Jesus. And so the disciples are watching to see what would happen next. And so in verse 41, something strange starts to take place. It says, and taking the loaves and fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and said a blessing, broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. So Jesus blesses the food, breaks it apart, gives it to his disciples and says, hey, take this to group A, group B, or however they numbered the groups or lettered the groups. And so the disciples would take it, and each disciple, I'm sure they thought that they were the only ones that got the food. They'd go, and they'd come back. They get more food, and they go, come back, and then they get more food. They go, and they come back, and it's another group, and it's another group, and it's another group. So imagine what's going on now in the minds of the disciples. Maybe there was initial shock and a surprise at what was going on. And then the shock is probably replaced by memories of what actually happened. It's like, oh yeah, it's Jesus. Of course something like this would happen. And so maybe it was a mild embarrassment of like, man, we're Jesus' followers. We should have seen this coming. But in any case, they take the food to everyone, and everyone gets fed. And not only do they get fed, but they eat their fill. in verses 42 to 44, it says this: "And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. And all those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men." Notice it says that they were satisfied. What does this mean? It means that they didn't just simply eat, but they ate until they couldn't eat anymore. Isn't that what it means to be satisfied when you eat? When you go to an all-you-can-eat Korean barbecue place, do you simply eat, or do you eat until you're satisfied? Would you stop after one piece of meat and say, "No, I'm good, I ate, I'm good, one piece is fine"? No, you'd order another round and another and another and another until 4-5 plates past regret, until you can't eat anymore, right? That's what it means to be satisfied when you eat. That's how much food went to all the different people in the crowd, and so much so, and not only that, but it says that there were 12 baskets left over filled with broken pieces of bread and fish. So, at the end of the story, where do we go from here? So it's an incredible story, but why does it matter to us? What does feeding 5,000 people loaves of bread and fish have anything to do with our lives here today? And so what I want to do is I want to look at 4 pieces of this story. And these 4 pieces carry with us reminders of who we are, of who Jesus is, and an invitation to engage in the world around us. Again, reminders of who we are, a reminder of who God is, and a reminder of how to engage the world around us. And so first, it's the crowds. What do we know about the crowds, and what do we learn about crowds in the story? The crowds were described as sheep without shepherd. In other words, they were unpredictable, they were uncontrollable, and they were uninvited. The crowds invited themselves to the getaway that Jesus and his disciples were headed towards. And not only did they invite themselves, they arrived without any food. And not only that, the problem, as we find out later, is it was such a massive gathering of people that the disciples had to seat them in groups of 50s and 100s to feed them all. And then even after they were fed, if we look at a similar passage talking about the same story in John, it says that after the meal, the crowd wanted to forcibly make Jesus king. In other words, they had their own motives for gathering, and so there was no predicting their motives. They didn't just come to hear Jesus teach. Once they got fed, they wanted to try to start a rebellion, and so he had to go hide himself away from the crowds after that story. And so we all have crowds in our lives, and I just don't mean your morning commute or a trip to the amusement park. I'm talking about your unpredictable, your uncontrollable, and your uninvited moments in your day-to-day that come in the form of relationships, situations, and circumstances. It's the unexpected trouble that comes from your coworker. It's the late-night phone conversation that you wish you didn't have to take. It's the things that in your life that you go, "Oh my gosh, again, I don't know if I can handle this." You look at these situations and relationships, and the enormity of the situation, much like these crowds were for the disciples, will leave you weak, tired, and powerless, going, "How am I ever going to face this?" But when we see Jesus with the crowds in the story, we see a few things. We see that crowds aren't things to be avoided. If anything, our relationship with Jesus brings us in proximity with the crowds of life. Through Jesus' life and ministry here on earth, if you read through his life story, you see that crowds were always a part of his life amongst the uncontrollable, unpredictable, uninvited crowds. And so if Jesus was always among crowds, as followers of Christ, how can we expect anything different? If we walk with him, if we call ourselves his disciples, we must be prepared to walk through the crowds in our lives when we least expect it, when we least want them, and we're least ready to be with them. And so we see this attitude of Jesus to the crowds is different from the one that we have typically in these situations. When we face crowds in our life, we want to run away, we want to avoid, we want to divert. But we read today that Jesus instead had compassion on them. The direction of compassion is completely different from avoiding, diverting, and running away from. When we see crowds in our life, we run away from them for the most part. But when we see anything with Jesus' reaction and his actions, compassion moves you towards the crowds, towards the different things that are uncontrollable, unpredictable, and uninvited into your life. And so Jesus' compassion with the crowds should actually also stir compassion in our own lives. Why is that? Because we were also that crowd. The crowds in the story are a reminder that Jesus had compassion on us when we were without a shepherd. And much like the crowds that we see in this story, before we met Jesus, we were also helplessly wandering through life without purpose, without hope, and without peace from the future. And when Jesus saw us, he did not avoid, he did not divert, and he did not run from, but instead, as you read in the passage, he took compassion on us. And so through the crowds, we are reminded of who we were without Jesus, sheep without a shepherd. And when we remember who we were before Jesus, then and only then are we able to take compassion on the crowd in our lives, knowing that the only difference between us and the crowds in our life is a shepherd. So that's the first reminder through the crowds. The second reminder comes through the disciples. Now, in many of the stories when we read about the disciples, it's very easy to become very critical, to laugh at them and say, dude, these disciples, they didn't have it together. When you see them react in different ways, we become the perfect armchair quarterback disciples saying, hey, this is where Peter got it wrong. This is where Andrew got it wrong. This is where John got it wrong. If I was them, I would have listened to what Jesus said. I would believe that Jesus was the Son of God. It would have been a different gospel if I was a disciple. And, we would do that and we jump in right away because the tendency is that we think that we're better than the disciples who we see do a lot of different foolish things. But the problem is that there's a difference between how we critique disciples in the Bible and how we end up acting just like them in everyday life. Remember the situation that the disciples were in. There was a massive crowd. They were hungry. The day was growing late. They had their own hunger and fatigue. It's easy to forget that in these circumstances that disciples' request to Jesus was very logical. Please send the crowds away before it gets too late because we don't have the money or capacity to feed this crowd. They weren't trying to be mean. They were just trying to do their best in their given circumstances. Except they forgot where they had come from and what they had just seen. Do you remember what we were talking about that happened right before this story? They had just come back from a missions trip that Jesus had sent them out on, 2 by 2, to do what they had only up until that point seen Jesus do on his own. They were able to heal the sick. They were able to cast out demons. They were able to pray for those that needed it. They were doing all these things, and just right before they got on the boat to go to this other side of the lake, they were telling Jesus how much stuff that they had seen and experienced. And so Jesus is saying, and it was a reminder of a promise that Jesus' presence went with them. It was not what they were doing. It was because Jesus himself went before them and was with them, and how quickly they forget that as soon as they cross the lake and they see another problem. They experience being dependent on Jesus and trusting by faith that they will be provided for, and just like that, in the next story, they forget all of that. Now, before we are now quick to judge yet again, isn't this where we often find ourselves? When we're in between the good moments of God's providence in our life, we often forget that he is with us always, and instead our primary action is to try to think through how to act according to what we believe is best. We may laugh at the disciples when they're trying to figure out amongst themselves, how do we come up with $33,000? But we often ourselves lay awake at night to deal with the crowds in our own lives with our two hands. If I only made a little more money, we say. If I can only figure out the right person to talk to. If I can just pass this problem off to someone else. And these are the thoughts that keep us up at night. And in very much the same way, we worry as much as we see the disciples worry in this passage. And so the moment I try to think about the fact that I feel like I'm not as bad as the disciples in this passage, all I have to think about is how often I'm aware of God's presence in the moments that I feel like I am about to be overwhelmed with the crowds in my own life. And more often than I like to admit, I forget what it's like to be in his presence and am quick to jump to strategies, to coping mechanisms, to planning and preparing, to moving at things as if I was on my own. Like the disciples who forgot who they were with, I often try to live my life without running to the one who's promised that he would be with me always. And so, even in that, in spite of that, Jesus chooses to work through his disciples. That's important to think about. As forgetful as they were, as doubtful as they may be, he was patient with them. He responds to their questions about 200 denarii, about the money they need, with an invitation to search the crowds. He feeds the crowds through the disciples who are again in the front row seats of seeing a miracle happen before their eyes. And even after this story, we see that they don't get it right. After the feeding of the 5,000, they forget again. And another miracle happens, and they forget again. And something else happens, and they forget again. And time again, God responds to his disciples, Jesus responds to his disciples with grace, with patience, and with love. And so the disciples in this story remind us that God works through us, but it's not because of who we are. God works through us, but it's not because of who we are. He works through the doubtful and forgetful, through the disciples, that we are reminded that Jesus is kind and patient with us. And by no means did we deserve to see God's work through us. We're doubtful, we're forgetful, we're impatient. We are prone to try to figure out our own path in the life when we feel like we are alone. But the disciples in this story remind us that God uses the foolish, the weak, the broken things in this world. And it's not because of us, but it's because of who he is. The third piece I want to focus on is the food. Now, the main dish in the story, as we've heard many times already, is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Not an extravagant meal. These were common food items. There's nothing fancy about them at all. It's as if you threw a large dinner party for someone. You set out all the fancy plates and the glasses and everything, and then it comes out on a silver platter, the main course, and then it opens up, and it's peanut butter and jelly bread, right? It's peanut butter and jelly. It's macaroni and cheese. It's rice and kimchi. It's like, okay, I mean, it's nothing to really celebrate. And so if you want to invite someone to a feast, loaves of bread and fish are probably not the way to go. But it's surprising that Jesus would use something common like bread and fish. He could have used anything else. He was Jesus. He could have turned the rocks into meat, could have had a grand old barbecue for 5,000 people, but he chose to use bread and fish. And what's also interesting is the amount of food that was available to the vastness of the crowds. Remember, there was 5,000 people at least, and all they had was 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It's like putting out 1 slice of pizza for a group of high school kids. Or it's like putting out a cup of coffee to a whole group of parents getting ready to take their kids to school. What's the point? It's going to be gone right away. It's as if you never put out anything at all. And so that's the same feeling that the disciples had when all they found in the huge crowd was 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And on top of that, it was from a small child. So 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish were unlikely to change anything in this crowd until, and only until, it was placed in the hands of Jesus. The moment that the disciples handed over that small lunch that was in their hands, everything changed. What was meant for one became food for many, so much so that everyone ate to their heart's content, and that there were 12 baskets left over, sign of abundance. So what do we learn from the food that we see in this story? The loaves of bread and fish are a reminder for us that Jesus uses the small, the ordinary, and the hidden things that we have in our hands to do only what he can do. Because that's the kind of God that he is. He would use what the world would consider without value, that are worthless, without any glamour or appeal, to show us that everything that is in his hands, that there is nothing that is irredeemable, that nothing is wasted, and that nothing is useless. That the things that we hold in our hands, when we look at others and we compare and say, can this be of any value? When we look before the world in front of us and say, will this make a difference? When we look and say, but this is so small and I don't know if this is even enough for myself. Jesus says, nothing that you give to me is without value. Nothing that you give to me is useless. And everything that you give to me will be far more than you can ever imagine. And so when we compare, let us remind ourselves that the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish are things that Jesus can choose to use, that would love to use if we only would place it in his hands. Last piece of the story that I want us to look at is Jesus himself. Specifically, I want us to look at 2 things that he said and what he did. So at first glance in the story, Jesus seems kind of mean. He seems kind of mean. He seems like that he kind of is just messing with his disciples. When the disciples so nicely ask him, remind him of the hour, he's like, hey, Jesus, it's late in the afternoon. It's time to send them home because it's dinner time or, it's time to eat. Jesus says, you go feed them. This sounds kind of mean, right? And when the disciples try to calculate how much money they need to feed the crowds, Jesus asked them, how many loaves are there? You go and see it. Also seems kind of harsh. So I actually wrestled a little bit with what Jesus said in this passage, and I asked myself, Why would Jesus say those things to disciples who are hungry, tired, out of ideas? Were they words of frustration? Was he frustrated with his disciples? Was he stressed? Or was there something deeper to the words that he said? But when I think about his actions and how he treats his disciples throughout the Gospels with such patience and kindness, I have to believe that what was said in this story was not harsh commandments, but they were grace-filled promises for his disciples and for us. And so when Jesus says to his disciples, you go and feed them, he's not leaving them on their own to solve the problem, but to remind them that they are being sent by him. That they were not going out on their own, but that Jesus himself was with them, would go before them, was walking beside them. That even in the face of an enormous crowd, his presence is his promise to them. Just one chapter before, they were sent out personally by him to do all sorts of miracles, to heal the sick, to cast out demons, to proclaim the good news. His invitation for them to go and see, you go and feed them, you go into the crowds, was a gentle reminder that he was with them, that they were not alone, that it's in his name that they are going, that he was inviting his disciples to trust them, to trust him, and that he would be with them no matter what he sends them to do. The second thing that he says, go and see, is not a futile search to find something that is not there. He's not mean, he's not being mean and telling his disciples, hey, go and see what's in this group of 5,000 people and maybe something will come up and it's this giant game of hide and seek. Instead, he is promising them that they will find what they are looking for. In the enormous crowd of over 5,000 people, they're able to find 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And his promise was in that moment that their eyes would be open and that they would see what that was already there. That they wouldn't see with doubtful eyes, they wouldn't see with the eyes that the world gave them, but instead that they would see with eyes of faith. So in this promise, he is inviting his disciples to trust that he would be the one that opens their eyes to see what only they would be able to see through him. And so in both of these promises, we actually see them combined through what he does in this passage. When the bread and the fish were given to him, he looks to heaven, he gives thanks, and he breaks the bread. And so when the early church heard this story, immediately in their minds, their mind goes to another story that comes a little bit later, and that's of the Last Supper. That in this time, as he breaks the bread, as he passes around the cup of wine, it's that same exact promise to his disciples. I will be with you always, and wherever you go, I will open your eyes so that you will see. And so it is through broken pieces of bread and fish that Jesus opens our eyes to because of him. Because he was broken, we are filled. Because he was given away, our hunger and our thirst have been satisfied. And because of his sacrifice in giving himself away, our eyes have been opened to see that in the love of God, we experience a life far more abundant than we could have ever asked for or imagined. That this abundant life in him never runs out, and it's what causes our soul to be satisfied in the very same way that we see this story come to an end when it says that 12 baskets were left over. That this is the promise for our lives, that as we trust in him, as we are sent by him, as we face the different crowds in our lives, that we don't go alone, that we meet them with compassion because we're reminded of who we were before we met God. That we are reminded that God uses us not because, or maybe in spite of us, because that's the kind of God that he is. That as we give him the little that we feel like we have to offer, we give it to a God who does not waste anything that he gives us in our lives. And that ultimately we look at him because it was only through him and the promise through his death and his resurrection that we experience an abundant life today. And so as we close, think about those reminders. Think about the reminder of the crowd, the reminder of the disciples, the reminder of the food, and the reminder of the promises of God. And as we think about those things, let us find courage and let's find a renewed faith that God sent us out to live and open our eyes to the abundant life that he has given for us. Let's bow our heads.